receive a certificate. And also within the next couple of days, I'll send out a link so you can watch it again. I have thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. It's absolutely fascinating, and I know you're going to as well. So thanks very much, Tony. Over to you.
Right, thanks, Amanda. I always feel a little bit sorry for Amanda, who's hosting the webinar for Macmillan, that she listens to it three times through. You'll notice that what I don't do is read a presentation. I kind of talk around the slides, and part of that, I think, is that I need to develop things over the 3 sessions, because my thinking develops as I'm doing the presentations. And as you know, as a teacher, one of the interesting things about teaching a new area or planning a new presentation is that it makes you focus on that idea, and it makes you see things in a slightly different way, because you bring a different focus to bear on particular events. Blended learning is a phrase that's appeared over the last 18 months. And I think it's a phrase that's kind of appeared about teaching through lockdown. And in a way, what it meant was we're now moving away from face-to-face teaching in the classroom, and we're doing teaching which is a blend of classroom-based work and home-based work. But as I was thinking about blended learning, and I was thinking, okay, so what's the difference between this webinar and the webinar that I ran about 6 months ago about learning from home? And I thought, well, the difference is that actually all learning is blended learning. Hiya, Pedro in Belize. I think you've been to some previous webinars, haven't you? And that made me think in detail about what we might mean by blended learning. And it took me to conversations that I'd had with a range of teachers from around the world when I was working on a book that's just been published called Transforming Teaching. And what that book is about 12 educators reflecting on how their practice has changed through teaching under the pandemic, and what we hope we will carry on doing, the differences in terms of our teaching practice that we would want to carry on. Because teaching has changed. Our teaching has changed. We've had to learn very quickly about how we might teach differently. And I wonder if one of the things that's happened is that we've started to notice more how our students learn, because we've been put in a slightly different situation. And sometimes when we're put in a different situation, we learn quickly, but we also notice what the impact of the changes in our teaching are. I've spent quite a lot of my time training teachers. So I'll move on to this slide. I always talk about myself as a mathematics teacher. So I still work in classrooms teaching mathematics to school students. I'm going to a museum in Leeds in the north of England where I live next week to work with a group of secondary age students in a maths museum, do some teaching there. And I've done some teaching in my grandchildren's school fairly recently. So I make sure that I still teach mathematics. And I think that's because I love mathematics. The other thing is that I think if we develop our mathematical understanding, so we become confident in mathematics, we develop a better understanding of the world. And I've said before on these sessions that over the last 18 months, mathematics has come to the fore, hasn't it? So all of our news is often started with some mathematics, started with some data about the virus, about the spread of the virus. And if we understand that data, we're better able to make decisions. But I was talking about how making changes makes us notice the difference in terms of learning. And one of the things that I often ask student teachers to do is to stop doing something which seems to come naturally as a teacher. So I remember as a teacher in my third year of teaching in in Sheffield, another northern city. I actually took away the teacher's desk from my classroom. I used it and I sat 4 children around it instead of it being a teacher's desk, because I wanted to see how my practice would change by there not being a desk there. And actually it made me stand in different places in the classroom. And one of the things that does is it makes you notice different things. I often tell student teachers to never start a lesson by saying, what did we do last time? Because that can be a default position, can't it? We say what our teachers have always said to us. Now, if we ban ourselves from saying those things, we have to start thinking about what we might say differently. Similarly, if we ban ourselves from asking for hands up, if we decide for a week we're not going to ask for hands up, what will that change about our practice? Maybe the things that we've had to change over the past year, which have been quite radical. We've literally not had a classroom. We've had to think very hard about learning, about how learning takes place. And I think what that suggests is that we've started to notice what this thing called blended learning is. And my argument is that all learning is blended learning. And what we've tended not to notice as teachers is all of the different influences on the students in our classroom in terms of their learning, because we've only ever really seen them in our classrooms in front of us. We've maybe not paid enough attention to all of the influences from outside the classroom, which we now have to pay attention to. Now, those of you that have been to my sessions before, isn't it interesting that we still use the language of attended and see? It confused Victoria. She thought I could literally see you, whereas I'm sort of using the language of I can see you, but meaning I can see you in the chat. So I can see that Dilyara has joined us from Russia as well. It's great to have so many people from Russia. So there are two of my grandchildren. I've got 3 grandsons, all live near Manchester in the UK, and I go over with my wife to look after them every weekend. My daughter runs a dog grooming salon. My son-in-law is a chef, so they both work at the weekends and need help looking after the kids. Because I was preparing a seminar on blended learning, I was noticing something different about the learning of my 3 grandsons over the weekend. So 3 stories about their learning linked to this idea of blended learning. Start with Quinn. Quinn is a little baby. He's now 1. As Holly set off for work in the morning, she said what she thought he needed to do, her words, was start to lift himself up onto the furniture. So he's got what we call a baby walker that he can move around the floor. It's got a wooden floor downstairs, so he can scoot about like a little bit like a robot. But he can't really reach things because he's surrounded by a big plastic kind of case with toys and things on it. Hi, Axa from Qatar. So we went upstairs to a bit of a quieter place, and he can sit unaided, and he was shuffling about on his bottom to get to toys, and I was doing that thing that you do with young children, which is put things just out of their reach, so it makes them shuffle over to it. But I remembered that my learning objective that I'd been set by my daughter was to help him lift himself up. So I held my fingers out at about his head level. Now, again, as you probably all remember, young children like to grasp your fingers. So he grasped both my fingers with his hands quite tightly. And then I very gradually lifted my fingers up so he could sense himself lifting. And as he sensed himself lifting up, he then pushed on his feet. So I could stop pulling with my fingers and allow him to push himself up. And there was delight in his face and a big smile when he got to full standing height. It was a new skill he'd learned. He could feel something new and different. I noticed that his feet was slightly spread out to the side, so he wasn't balancing very well. So I moved his feet so they were parallel and pointing forwards. As I did that, he lifted himself up on his toes, which is something that I'd noticed him doing in his baby walker. So he was noticing something different. He was learning how to stand, and he was learning about that from somebody who maybe had got more experience in terms of how you might teach somebody to stand. So that was teaching in the same way as teaching any other skill is. He was noticing the different feelings that come with that learning. A part of the blend is that he's now probably feels as though he's becoming more grown up. He's more like his brothers who he sees walking round. He's seen parents walking round. So all of these influences all around him are contributing to him learning. And I always think it's amazing when you think how much young children learn before they ever get anywhere near school. They learn to speak. Often they'll be learning to speak in more than one language. So a lot of the children that you're working with will be learning to speak in different languages, not just one language. They may have two languages at home, or they may have a language at home and a language at school. And they do that without a teacher. They do that without us. But they don't do that without anybody. They do that with a whole load of influences in the family, influences from the community, influences from the media, both written and on the television or films that they might be going to see. So there's a story about blended learning and a 1-year-old. Tate, who doesn't appear in that picture, is 4. He's just started kindergarten. He's doing what we call reception in the UK. And the reception are fascinated by him because they're saying to me, I'm having a conversation with his teacher next week about the sort of learning he's doing in terms of mathematics. He's actually bringing a different way of looking at mathematics to his teacher. So he is part of the blend of learning for his teacher at the moment, as well as his teacher being part of his blend, being one of influences on his learning. And when he got home from school on Friday, I sat down and I said, do you want to do some mathematics? And he said, yes. So we sat, and he was working through some of the Max Maths books, because I always like to try the books out that I've written to make sure that they're kind of appropriate. So I don't just send books out into the market that aren't road tested, that aren't child tested. And one of the activities he was doing, he was closing his eyes. He was picking up coins out of a pot and then opening his hand and working out counting how many coins he had. I suppose part of my teaching was showing that if he laid them out in a straight line, it was easier to check that he counted them all by touching rather than having them all in a pile. And I started to think about, so what's influenced Tate to be so interested in mathematics? What's his blend been? And some of it is my fault, that we talk about maths. He looks at the books that I write because we have those conversations. Part of it is his brother. He's got an older brother. His brother's 9, and he sees him doing his homework when he comes home from school. He's also noticed Felix watching a television called Number Blocks, a program called Number Blocks. So he has that as one of his influences, one of his blends. We quite often travel on a train and we notice bigger and smaller and large things and parallel lines, and we have mathematical conversations on the train. When we walk down the road into town, he's noticing shapes. We talk about shapes. He's noticing numbers. So the environment is another blend. So you can see there's all sorts of influences there on him. As we were counting the coins, one of the tasks was to colour in a number of circles that corresponded to the coins he was counting. He counted 5 coins. Hi, Charlene. Good morning. But he couldn't actually colour in the circles accurately. So I thought I'll help him colour in the circles, as well as thinking about. It's interesting that his mathematics was beyond his fine motor skills. As I coloured in 3 of the circles, he said, "Grandad, stop, let me colour the other 2 in." So he was showing me, age 4, he knew intuitively that 3 plus 2 equals 5, but he doesn't yet have the language for that. So isn't it interesting that he's been able to draw on all of these influences around him to become quite advanced in terms of his mathematics? In fact, advanced beyond his use of language in mathematics. So one of the things that I learned from that is how important it is to have these discussions, mathematical discussions, all of the time, so he comes to learn mathematical language as well. The same Friday morning, Tate stories Friday afternoon. In the morning, me and Felix and Tate had been walking to school, and Felix had been a bit worried because he had a test, and every Friday morning they have a test on multiplication facts. They have a spelling test and they have a test on multiplication facts, and it was the 12 times table, the multiplication facts for 12. And Felix was a bit worried because he said this was one of the hard ones. I'm never quite sure why some kids see some tables as harder than other tables. So I said, I don't think it's a harder one, Felix. And you could see he looked a bit confused because obviously somewhere he'd been told, or he'd got the message that 12 times table was difficult. And that sometimes our blends, our influences can be a little bit negative. We have to be able to filter those out of the blend. So I said to him, well, can you do your 10 times table? And he said, well, yes, 10s are easy. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120. In the UK, we go up to the 12 times table. I know that some of you will only go up to multiplication facts by 10. And I said, well, if you know your 10s and you know your 2s, you know your 12s, because 12 times 4 is the same as 10 times 4, which is 40, and 2 times 4, which is 8. So you can find that by 48. I think, Adrian, we go up to the 12 times table. It's kind of been traditional. The currency, the old currency, before we went into decimalisation, there was 12 pence in a shilling. So there's links to 12 there, and there's links to multiples of 12 in telling the time. So it's just kind of a historical thing. So I gave Felix one way of working out the 12 times table, and then we looked at the pattern of numbers that are in the 12 times table. So 1 times 12 is 12, then 24, then 36. Then 48. And I asked him to look for the pattern so he could see the pattern in terms of the 10s going up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And it goes 12, 24, 36, 48, 60. So the ones go up in the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, 0. So that gave him another way of looking at the 12 times table. And then finally I just counted up in 12s and counted back in 12s. So he got a sense of the pattern and that was in his head. And that kind of gave him 3 different ways of remembering the 12 times table and his multiplication facts. So if we think of Felix learning his multiplication facts, his blend is to do with his teacher supporting him in learning those facts. His friends all learning the same facts and having those discussions and conversations. Watching the television, I talked about the number blocks program. The written resources that he uses in school, and then his granddad showing him 3 different ways. So even for something as straightforward as learning your multiplication facts, there's a whole range of factors come into play. And that's why I think all learning is blended learning. So in terms of what I'm looking at, you'll see that I've already started thinking about blended learning and what it might be, and just claiming that it's learning. There's no learning that isn't blended learning. And maybe what's happening now is that our role as a teacher is shifted to supporting students in developing that blend and drawing on that blend effectively. And that we also have a personal blend, and that those blends will be different. I look at what we've learned and what the teachers that I worked with on the book that I described have learned from teaching under the pandemic and what they've learned about blended learning. And then we'll spend a few minutes at the end wondering about what our hopes for the future might be. Well, let's carry on exploring blended learning for a while. And I'm just going to play you a minute or so of a song by a musician called Serious Sam Barrett, and then I'll explain how that fits in to this discussion about blended learning. It starts quietly, you'll hear the record going on, and then it goes into the song.
Kind of girl you'd want to take home. Your mother wouldn't like her, your daddy wouldn't leave that poor girl alone. She's the kind of girl that'll leave you hanging on the phone, leave you out in the cold and the pouring rain. 'Cause she's the kind of girl that I'd like to sing to. She's the kind of girl that I'm bound to cling to. She's the kind of trouble that I'd like to get into, and I hope she'd like to get into me. She's not the kind of girl that'll do what she's told. She'd look into your eyes and said she's been good as gold. You want her so bad, but she treats you so cold. She acts like she's done nothing wrong. She's the kind of girl that I'd like to sing to. She's the kind of girl that I'm bound to cling to. She's the kind of trouble that I'd like to get into, and I hope she'd like to get into me.
And I remember to turn my microphone on all by myself, Amanda. The first two sessions I had to be reminded to unmute myself. So Tony, why have you just played us a song? What on earth's that got to do with us as teachers? What on earth's that got to do with blended learning? I'm particularly interested in that song, and I'm particularly interested in Sam as a musician, not because he's a friend, he's also a successful musician, but because I play music all the time. And I play music all of the time, again, when Felix and Tate and Quinn are around. And that particular song is something that Tate in particular, but Felix as well, makes me play again and again and again. And you know how sometimes the kids that you teach want to do the same activity again and again and again, that they kind of decide when they want to repeat something. And I was fascinated what it might be about that particular song. In fact, Tate is so interested in it. He's decided that he's going to be a guitarer when he grows up, and he's going to be the guitarer for Sam Barrett. So Sam's looking forward to the time when he has a new guitarist in his band. And I started to kind of analyse the song and analyse what Sam does in terms of his influences. And then I realised that what I was doing was thinking about the blend which Sam had used to learn how to become a folk musician. And then that took me to think about the different sorts of skills that Sam has in terms of his blend, So he's also a very skilled skateboarder, and he makes the best coffee, well, actually, in the world. And I say that because I've had coffee in Colombia, I've had coffee in Russia, I've not had coffee in Belize yet, so I may find somebody better in Belize. Got a real knowledge of how he makes coffee, using coffee from many of the places that you come from. Sam is a Leeds lad, comes from Leeds, and you could see in the video there's a very strong Northern English root in what he's writing about and where he's coming from. His dad is a good folk musician, so he's learned from his father about folk music. He's been surrounded by folk music, although in some senses that song's not a traditional English folk song. He's also over many years toured in Alabama in the United States with another very good friend. So there's a sense there of American roots music influencing what's going on. He was in punk bands as a young man, and he's still friends with all of those people. So there's a contemporary influence there. He still reads a lot around the history of folk music, and his latest album was inspired by him finding a book in a second-hand bookshop of old songs from the Northeast. So all of these influences come together to create that sort of a song. And he's experienced and practiced in the skill of songwriting. So over time, he's developed those skills. So that's a blend, isn't it? That's what we hear. His output is a song, but there's a whole load of influences gone into creating that song. And that's why a song by Sam Barrett is different to a song by people that you will listen to. They will all have many different influences. Let's think about skateboarding and how you learn to skateboard. Skateboarders come as a community, don't they? If we ever go down to a skate park, and I imagine there are skate parks in most of the countries that you're from, there's always groups of people, and they watch each other. They watch each other's tricks. They want to do the same tricks as each other. They support each other. They applaud when people get the tricks right. I was talking to Sam, and he said they watch YouTube videos again and again and again to analyze exactly what you need to do as that trick. They do know the history of skateboarding, which is still developing because it's now an Olympic sport. So it's not just about practicing a particular thing. It's embedded in a culture, and it's embedded in a history. And there's a whole, again, blend that comes together to make you a successful skateboarder. And in terms of being a barista, there's a science to making coffee. So it needs to be at the right temperature. You need to know the temperature that you need to set the machine at. You need to be able to change the settings so that it takes the right amount of time for the water to be forced through the coffee. You need the right setting in terms of how you grind the coffee. And that comes through a lot of skill in terms of tasting coffee, so you know when it's right. And you start to learn the difference between different sorts of coffee that come from different regions, that come from different countries. Literally a blend in terms of coffee. So 3 different blends there that lead to 3 different outcomes. So again, this is me claiming that everything we learn comes through a blend of supports. One of the jobs that I do, so I work mainly from home, and I do 3 main jobs. One is writing maths books, and alongside that running webinars such as this for publishers like Macmillan, and that's the side of me that most of you probably know. I edit a journal called Mathematics Teaching, so that's kind of how I keep myself informed about latest developments, and that's the journal of the Association of Teachers of Mathematics in the UK. And then I do some teaching and some work for the University of Nottingham. The course that I teach is based in Bangkok. So Nottingham University run an international postgraduate teaching course. It's in 13 different countries. The country that I work in is Bangkok, but we take students from all around Southeast Asia. And I was interested because we actually start that course by thinking about blended learning, because it is a blended learning course. There's intensive, used to be face-to-face teaching at the beginning of the course. It was an intensive synchronous taught session online this year and last year. But for the rest of the time, it's an online course. So we ask the participants, the students, the learners, to think about what their blend is. And here's two diagrams that they came up with. And the blend is our colleagues in school, other students that we work with, the teacher, the tutor, our family and friends that we're surrounded with, our own work as an educator, and the course materials that are provided. So Victoria's just asked there how to use blended learning in English lessons. And I'll actually use a specific example from English later on. But in a way, Victoria, it would be a similar diagram. So actually, your teenage students are blended learners. When they're learning English, they're blended learners. They're learning English alongside their peers in the classroom. So giving them opportunities to speak English to their peers, and maybe an expectation that they'll use English sometime outside the classroom, would be helpful. You will provide them with course materials which support them in terms of developing their English. And that might be things that they read, it might be links to television programs, it might be other resources that they can use in their own time as a way of developing their English. They'll be their own interests. It may well be that they watch TV, and they watch TV from the States or from the UK or from other English-speaking places. So that's part of the blend of them learning as well. It may be that they use English with their family and friends. They could teach their parents some English. Maybe their parents already speak some English, and they'll learn English from their conversations with you. So in a way, that's always been the case, but it's become more important over the lockdown because suddenly they've been thrown back on the other parts of the blend, and maybe us as teachers have taken a little bit more of a back seat. I will ask that question, but so don't be shy. Think of something that you've learned. One of the things that seems to have happened over the pandemic is that we've all spent a bit of time learning something new. I've spent a lot of the time, I've got a very small garden, but we spent a lot of time growing things, and I really enjoy cooking. So I've been learning more about cooking. I've particularly been learning more about Thai cooking because I love the Thai cuisine. So think about something that you've learned recently, and how were you supported in that learning? What was your blend in terms of that learning? So whilst you're typing and whilst you're putting something in the chat, and it'd be lovely to hear about things that you've learned, let me explore the Thai cooking a little bit more. So I think part of that blend is my experience in Bangkok. I've been traveling out to Bangkok every year for the last 10 years. And as a result of being there, I've been able to travel lots of countries linked to Bangkok, lots of Southeast Asia, and come to love the cuisine. So I wanted to, and the people, and wanted to feel a little bit more connected perhaps with the people by learning how to cook the dishes that I've got used to learning. And that can take me back there. But I like cooking in general, and I'm interested in the way that Thai cooking uses spices that's slightly different from Indian cooking and very different from UK cooking. So that's another part of the blend. I enjoy cooking for other people, so I enjoy being able to serve food to other people. That's another part of the blend. So it's not just that I've learned how to cook Thai food by reading a book, although books have come into it and YouTube has come into it. It's also linked to my life experience. You're all being shy, none of you are wanting to think about something that you've learned. But maybe you'll carry on thinking about this after the after the session has finished. I think one of the things that makes us better teachers is reflecting on what makes us a good learner. And if we can think about how we learn things, we become a better teacher. And maybe that's been one of the advantages of teaching under the pandemic, that we have started reflecting on our own teaching in a different way. I agree, Victor. I think the pandemic has changed our learning. It's made us reflect more on the impact of our teaching, hasn't it? So maybe it's made us notice our learning in a different way. It's kind of back to what I was saying about having a different focus. So having a focus which is thinking about blended learning made me notice Tate and Quinn and Felix's learning in a different way last weekend, because I was aware that I was giving this talk today. And I think you're right, DNL, that we've had to manage time in different ways. And I think one of the things I'll talk about later is that students have started to think about managing time in a different way. And in some ways, we've had to hand over control to the students to encourage them to manage time. And that's good for them, because that's what we do as learners. Again, if we think about our learning, I'm still learning to play the piano. And one of the things I need to do is find a time in the day to do that. And I know that it's no good being in the evening, because actually I'm too tired to play the piano. I'm not good enough yet to be able to just play it for relaxation. So I need to play the piano. I usually try and play the piano about 11 o'clock in the morning, when I'm still fairly fresh, and it refreshes me. I go out running, and I do that first thing in the morning, because I know if I don't go out first thing in the morning, I won't do it later in the day, because other things will take over. So we all manage time in that sort of a way. And I think the pandemic's allowed our students to, or has maybe forced our students into thinking about how they might manage time differently. And maybe that's one of the things we've had to support them in doing. So going to the book, it's a book called Transforming Teaching. One of the discussions that we had, and this was 12 teachers from all around the world, from Australia, Mongolia, Thailand, Myanmar, South Africa, Kenya, Belize, Brazil, Spain, the UK. And we wanted to think about how the pandemic had changed our approach. And I'm I'm linking all of that back to blended learning. And one of the things that changed is parental and school expectations changed. And you've been talking about that on the chat. School expectations changed in terms of how much could be covered in lessons. And I think the planning process changed, so that as a teacher, what I was trying to do was find a fairly short stimulus for learners, which would ask them to engage in some sort of activity at some time later in the day, and then report back to me. So my focus as a teacher was finding useful activities that could support their development. I think our expectations on the parents either changed, or we became more aware of how important they are in the process. So rather than parents just being engaged in supporting students in homework, they suddenly became quite important in terms of becoming almost partner teachers. So that meant that what we had to do was support the parents in developing their knowledge. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing that we've had to think about carefully is both our well-being and our students' well-being. And maybe we've thought more about what's called the affective side of learning. We don't learn effectively if we're not feeling safe, if we're not feeling secure, if we're hungry, if we've not got the basics, if we don't feel safe in our house. If we're so worried about the pandemic that that's all consuming, we're not going to be able to learn anything. If we can use our teaching to support people's understanding of the pandemic, which is one of the things I was doing under lockdown, maybe that can help both develop mathematics and our learning. So that becomes another part of the blend, doesn't it? And one of the things that we've had to do is find clips from the web, for access to resources that we could use quite quickly, because that saves us time in our planning. And there's a little clip at the bottom. Michael was one of the co-authors of the book. He's called Michael Minas. He lives in Melbourne in Australia. And his YouTube channel, which there's a link to there, has got literally hundreds of mathematics games. And they just use a pack of playing cards. And what I really like about them is they're modelled by him playing with his son. And I know they're effective because I've used those a lot with young students that I've been working with under lockdown. So I could say, go to this game on YouTube, play it with your parents, and then at the end of the day we'll come back and we'll talk about what we've learned by playing that game. So there's a link for you in terms of a resource that you might find useful. One of the teachers talked about how when they were in school, there was often, he used the phrase heavy debate, when they were planning new topics, when they were thinking about new topics, they would get together as a group of teachers and they would discuss how they were going to plan that. And what they had to do was find a way of doing that when they weren't literally in the same school. And for them, it was using WhatsApp to discuss what was going on. You'll know from your experience as teachers that when you're in school and you have a wonderful lesson, something really exciting happens in a lesson, the first thing you want to do is tell one of your colleagues about it. You want to share the joy. You want to share that excitement. And it's not just because you're showing off, it's because it's a way of you thinking through, so why has that been effective? Why has that happened? How can I recreate that again in another lesson? And you learn about how you might do that by talking to a colleague. That's part of your blend of professional development. And similarly, if you've had a really challenging situation, either with an individual student, an individual learner, a group of learners, or just those times when lessons go wrong, you think you plan, we've all done it, we all think we planned a great lesson, we go in and it doesn't work. For some reason it doesn't work. Again, we want to talk to people about that. So we've needed to find new ways of doing that. And that's all part of blended learning. That's all part of how we develop as teachers and how we influence our learners in a different way. So I know that some people have gone for walks with other people to talk about it. I know that some people have used WhatsApp. Some people have used different sorts of chat rooms. But to develop a kind of new group identity, both for teachers and for students. And maybe another thing that's happened through the pandemic is because we're all faced by the challenge of the pandemic. That's brought us closer together in some ways because we're all meeting that challenge together. And our relationships with the students have changed. And I think the main way that they've probably changed is there's been a slight shift in control. So I said at the beginning that the blend, maybe the blend in classroom used to be, teacher introduces an idea, maybe gives out a resource and the students engage in activity with that resource. And then at the end of the lesson, there'll be some kind of summary. The students will report back or the teacher will report back. So really, the blend is just teacher, activity, student, just three influences. And the students all work together at the same time on the same activity and all spend exactly the same amount of time on it. Suddenly, we're not in control of the amount of time that the students are spending on something. We're not even in control of where they might carry out that learning. The students have taken control. And like I said earlier, maybe that's actually helping them with things like time management. But also, maybe it's a more realistic view of what learning is. So some students will spend a lot of time on a particular activity, and some students will spend less time. A bit like you do when you're learning new things. But we'll all get back together at some stage and report back to it, or report back on it. So in terms of our relationships with students, we're starting to allow them more flexibility. The fact that they've got more control is more inclusive. They're making decisions about how they'll learn things and where they'll learn things, about how they'll report back on it. They're becoming more resilient through our support and their community's support as a result of learning under the pandemic, and so on. So maybe that's been something that positive that's come out of teaching under the pandemic. But what we need to be careful is we need to make sure that we are still doing that checking in process with our students. Maybe sometimes it's easier to miss the students that are being quiet. We know in the classroom if somebody's being a bit quieter than usual, and we can have a little conversation with them separately. We need to find ways of doing that virtually. And we've been talking about parents throughout. There's been a lot of talk about the involvement of parents throughout the chat. It was interesting working on the book. A colleague called Seb, who works in an international school in Mongolia, was saying around his school there's a real tradition of parents and siblings working together on learning. So it wasn't something that was a particular challenge for him. Whereas in Brazil, the teacher was saying, well, actually our parents tend to hand over responsibility for education to the school and don't get involved. And it's been quite difficult for them to get involved with the parents in that way. One of the sets of parents, and these were Australian parents, got in contact with a teacher called Jess, and they said, now I finally understand what you do at school. And that was because of the different nature of the materials that were being sent home. So whereas before they might have been sending home fairly closed questions, so it might be spellings tests, revising spellings, revising number facts, thinking about Victoria talking about English, maybe flashcards with new vocabulary. So what we're doing is offering fairly closed activities for the parents, and what the parents assume is that that's what school's like all the time. And of course it isn't. That's what homework has become like. School will often be much more open, will often be much more investigatory, will often be much more people working in groups and working on group work. So parents now understand actually what's going on in school because we're involving them in a different way. And maybe that's something that can remain, that we don't just send homework home, we send more open activities, more stimulating activities, so they can work together with parents. And that allows the parents, the role of the parents in terms of the blend of learning of the students to become more important, or maybe acknowledges the importance of the parents. I'm just going to read you a little section of the book now. And we finished off by thinking about particular successes, the best lessons that we'd taught. And as I'm reading these, think about the blend. So think about the different influences, the different resources, the different arrows pointing in towards the student as a learner. And there's a set of bullet points there. And think about how the activities that I'm reading you link to those particular successes. So the first little paragraph from a teacher called Delma Zib, who is a high school teacher in Belize, and he's a history teacher. My best lesson was the discussion around banana republics, he writes. There's already excellent material online in terms of videos that I can download. There's loads of good material on YouTube. There's a wealth of readings, mainly academic papers, that I could extract notes from for the students, and I could rewrite sections of the papers so they were suitable for them. Imagine how much learning is going on there for Delma, for the teacher. I used a series of cartoons, political cartoons. They created their own cartoons. I wanted to know what they were thinking as well as what they were understanding. I don't want them to just remember the dates. I want them to understand the significance of what happened on those dates and to ask why something happened, not when it happened. So there's been a shift there in terms of the students becoming historians, not just memorizers of dates. So there's something more realistic in terms of the learning. They're developing the skill of being a historian. And the blend is the teacher's experience, videos online, including YouTube, academic papers, their teachers' interpretations of academic papers, cartoons, and they're drawing on all of that to be assessed by drawing their own political cartoon, which is a new form of assessment. So there's been quite a transformation there in terms of the lesson. Louise, who's again a high school teacher in an international school in Spain, and this is a description of some of her teaching online with students at the end of their education and thinking about science, probably thinking about doing science at university. She writes, our school does not subscribe to scientific journals, but I think they're important for enriching A-level, that's the top level exam. And because students were at home using their own devices, it was just a case of showing them where they can get the information from. So we've moved now from Delma providing all of the information to high school students, probably aged about 13, 14, 15, to Louise working with students who are aged 17, 18, and just saying, you can access these papers in these particular places. And they're taking control of finding the papers. Some decided to work on their own, and some in groups of 3 or 4, reading several different articles, summarizing them, and then choosing which platform to present their findings, which resulted in some amazing interactive presentations, games, and videos. So they're choosing what they read, they're choosing how they read it, they're choosing the platform that they're going to present on, and they're choosing whether they're going to do a presentation, a video, or a game. They have become scientists. They're preparing themselves for academic conferences. They're preparing themselves for university. It's called authentic assessment. When we assess learning by showing the students how they will use this learning in the future in a realistic way, it's authentic assessment. Quite often we use inauthentic assessment. So authentic assessment in history wouldn't be just writing down the dates that something happened. That's not what historians do. Assessment in science is preparing a presentation about what you've learned from reading a whole range of research papers. Let's go into, I said I'd talk about English. One of the in Melbourne had set up book clubs, reading clubs for books with her primary age students, but this would certainly work with secondary age students. And what she did was offer them a series of 6 different texts, and the students chose which book that they would want to read. And they could either read it on their own or they could read it with friends. But what happened at the end of that, it was over 2 weeks, the group who'd all read the same book got together in a Zoom meeting, and they prepared a little presentation about the book. So they were becoming literary critics, and again they were doing what academics do. They were becoming academic in terms of analysing text, but you can imagine how well they were developing their language at the same time. And they were choosing the text to read and how to present it. The last one is from a kindergarten class, and it's Vicky, and she's teaching in Myanmar. I enjoyed the scavenger hunts with the younger children. They had so much fun having to look for something at home and running against the clock to find an object to show in class. For example, the colour green, I loved this lesson. It created such a positive atmosphere in class. I'm interested in Vicky's writing about her online experience, almost as if it's actually a lesson in the school. The children had 5 minutes time to find as many green things as they could around their apartment. They'd run off, run round and bring back plants or a shoe or some vegetables, say. It was amazing what they came up with. It was definitely a better lesson than in class, because in class they would preview what their peers would bring to school and either all bring in the same thing or say why their thing was better than somebody else's. So she's saying this actually worked better than the same lesson in class. I would surround my lesson with vocabulary through a show and tell, descriptions, colours and uses of the object. For example, oh, where did you find that? And I would link this to a large or a small area. She'd use language of position, and I could link it to mathematics. In front of, behind, on top of, all those sorts of things. I'd ask, is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? What's it made out of? Which links to science. And we could talk about where the foods might grow. Do you like it? This would link to their personal opinion and develop their vocabulary on their thought process. We would discuss everyone's object one at a time, and everyone would have the chance to chime in with their opinions. It was a wonderful lesson. Now, I won't go through each of those bullet points, but I think you can see how those best lessons from those teachers all around the world, so this is with students from all around the world, had those bullets in common. And then one of the things we can think about as we return to school is how can we support this sort of blended learning back in the classroom? How can we develop book groups in the classroom? How can we develop using science journals in the classroom? And how can we maintain the relationships that we've developed with parents? And maybe through developing blended learning and drawing on what we've learned, what we will do is actually develop a more equitable and just education. And part of that is by allowing learners to have more control over what they're learning, where they're learning it, and when they learn it. And this morning, I questioned that idea about more fun, and I went back to the 3 stories at the very beginning of Quinn and Tate and Felix. But then I remembered the joy in Quinn's face as he lifted himself up and he giggled and laughed. That Tate had described the activity we'd done as a game to his mum when his mum got back, and Felix's delight in doing very well in his tables test. So hopefully actually things do become more fun. And something to leave you with, I'm sorry I've not left enough time for questions. We may have some quick questions. That blended learning, our focus on blended learning, will lead to innovations that we can continue as we move into whatever the next phase of teaching and learning is in our schools, because we don't really know what that phase is yet. So thanks very much for listening. We've got a couple of minutes for questions if anybody's got any questions, and thanks very much for your engagement on the chat. That's been really helpful.